beginning of the second event today, but the beginning of a year-long celebration dedicated to recognizing the 175th. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. How about now? Okay. This is the beginning of a year-long series of events celebrating the 175th anniversary of the namesake of our college, Eugenio María de Hostos. And we are very pleased to have Dr. April Mayes as our inaugural lecturer. Some of you came from the musical salute to Hostos, which was organized by Professor Lizette Cologne. Thank you, Lizette. And the representatives of the Humanities Department, both painting and vocals. Thank you, Humanities Department. So to get us started, I would like to invite our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Carmen Cubayas Vega, for opening remarks.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon to everyone. How's everybody today?
Good.
Oh, I don't know about that. It is March. How's everybody today? Great. Very nice. We are indeed pleased to have our wonderful speaker today, Dr. April Mayes, who comes to us from Pomona. And we are glad that she decided to come to a little bit colder climate to visit with us. We're hoping it won't be too cold, although I hear there might be rain in the forecast. But she's going to be with us, and she's got a really warm heart, in addition to some wonderful knowledge and experience that she's going to share with us. I really want to especially thank Professors Orlando Hernandez and Ernest Dialongo and their committee for all the fine work they have done. It takes a great bit of work to organize all of these activities, and I can see that they recruited a number of really good co-conspirators, like we said, in there for that wonderful celebration. And the president, too, who's hosting a reception for the faculty and staff later. And I know that Dr. Mayes will be meeting with the students tomorrow as well. So that's another glorious opportunity to dialogue with her. And I have to say, there are not that many women scholars in this particular area of work. And she stands out among the ones that are there. And we're very happy that she was able to accept the invitation to be with us. I know that Professor Dialongo is going to introduce her and her work, but I want to say that having our institution be a Hispanic serving institution, and an institution that really is rooted here in the Bronx and has contributed so much to the community here in terms of educating its citizenry, we are really delighted to have someone here to talk about the struggles of women and issues of race and class that have kind of shaped some of that struggle and also have shaped some of the triumphs that have resulted. So we are really very pleased to have this happen here on the campus. We are absolutely in awe of the Hostos legacy that he left for many of us to share and know and love. And I know that we have many people who are very passionate about the work of Hostos. And this is only the beginning of this wonderful year. It's a triumphant year, I expect, with all of the activities that have been planned that will go on into next fall. So please be on the lookout for all the advertisements and all the activities that are there, because you can just get, it's like taking a class, really, to come to all of these events and learn what there is to learn about that Hostos legacy. So I thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and I will turn it back.
So I'm not sure if I introduced myself. I'm Ernest Dialongo. I teach history here at the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department and one of the co-coordinators of Hostos175 with Professor Orlando Hernandez of the Humanities Department. So thank you, Madam Provost, for your remarks and also for your generous support for this event. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. April Mayes. Dr. Mayes is Associate Professor of History and Dean of Women at Pomona College in Claremont, California, where she teaches courses in Latin American and Caribbean history, U.S. Latin American relations, colonial Latin American women's history, Afro-Latin America, women in politics in Latin America, and race, sexuality, and power in the Caribbean. Dr. Mayes is the recipient of numerous awards, including grants from the Public Affairs section of the United States Embassy in the Dominican Republic for her conferences Gender and History and Transnational Hispaniola, which is the focus of her most recent work. She is a Fulbright Fellow, a recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation Humanities Fellowship, and, closer to home, she received a fellowship from the Dominican Studies Institute here at CUNY City College, just across the river. She is the author of numerous works, including, I wrote Forthcoming, but the book is actually out, The Mulatto Republic, Class, Race, and Dominican National Identity, University Press of Florida, 2014. She is also the co-editor of a 2-volume collection of primary documents in Spanish about Dominican feminism, aptly titled 100 Years of Dominican Feminism, covering the years 1861 to 1965, and these are to be published by the Archives of the Dominican Republic, as well as a selection of articles, including Transnational Hispaniola, Towards New Paradigms in Haitian and Dominican Studies, 2013, with Stephanie Roman, A Patriarchal Rite of Passage, an exploration of gendered migration histories and the erasure of women, and finally, Why Dominican Feminism Moved to the Right, Class, Color, and Women's Activism in the Dominican Republic, 2008. We are very pleased to have Dr. April Mayes deliver her lecture, Hostos and the Woman Question in Santo Domingo, a consideration of gender and nation building in Hostosian Thought and Practice. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a packed house. This is really scary, but I so appreciate you being here. First, I've got to ask your president for a favor, Felix. So this is one of the first books I ever bought as a graduate student at the University of Michigan. Would you sign it for me, please? Oh, no, you understand. Okay, yeah. So once I got that, I had to get that done. I've been thinking of ways to do that it was really too much time. So thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here at Hostos Community College. Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, Orlando, for the invitation. Thank you, Ginetta, for putting my name out there. Thank you, friends who come in to visit. If I have any hermanas in the audience, I go, oh, woo! Thank you. SLU in the house. Thank you very much, hermana, for being present, for your support. And thank you, Felix, Madam Provost, for making this visit possible. Where are my students? Where are the students in the house? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. Yay! Okay, I know you're here for extra credit. It's okay. I don't take it personally. I do not take it personally. But trust me, you're going to go away. Oh, yeah, so much more. Okay, so I have 3 questions that I want you to write down, because I know you have to take notes. You probably have to write up a 1-pager, right, for your professors. Is that right? That's what I do. Okay, so here are the 3 questions. This will just help you organize your thoughts for the talk. Ready? Ready? So the first question is, in your evaluation of me, did I do what I said I was going to do? Right? So I'm going to outline in the presentation what it is I'm going to cover, what I'm going to talk about. And the first point of evaluation is, did she do everything she said she was going to do? Did she forget something? And then if I forgot something, ask the question at the end, okay? Ask that question of me. The second, are you ready? So let me know. Heads up when you're ready. Okay, the second question I want you to write down is, are you persuaded by what I have to say? Are you convinced? And why are you convinced? Or not? Is it because I'm fabulously dressed today? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Getting love. Come on. No, we do not judge historians by their clothes. That would be really too scary if we did. But sometimes we do at AHAs. Yeah. So, are you persuaded by what I have to say? Are you convinced by the evidence I present, by the logic, right? By my thinking through the topic, my conclusions? Are you convinced? And again, if you're not, let me know at the end. If you are, then again, let me know at the end, and let's ask questions to further our thinking, okay? And the third question I want you to write down, now this requires audience participation. Are you ready? I'm from California. We do these things back west, right? You East Coast people tend to be all, look at me, right? Okay, so this requires some audience participation, which is to say, I need you to adapt your best Valley Girl voice. Got it? And say, oh my God, so what? Can you do that? Oh my God, so what? And that basically is the question, like, why have I been sitting here listening to her for 40 minutes? What does it all mean? Why does this matter? The why question. Why is this significant? Why has she spent so many years of her life on this topic? I'm not the only one. Orlando's done it. Ernest does it. Felix has done it. We spend years developing our historical analyses, right? Why? Why is Hostos significant? Remains important to us today? Why does it matter to think about gender and political formations, gender in history? Why is it important to think about feminism historically? Okay? Those are the why, some of the why questions. You might come up with some of your own why questions. And I hope, for me, the most important is that I hope I answered the third question for you, right? So, you got those three? Did I do what I promised I told you I was going to do in the beginning? Are you persuaded? Why does it matter, right? So you can organize a one-page essay just answering all of those questions, and your professors would, I think, appreciate that. Yes? I want to tell you something else, and I'm not trying to boast because I hope to meet some of you tomorrow, and I requested time with students because I wanted to talk to Dominican students and Haitian students. I wanted to, meet Hostos, right, in a different way. Pomona, we have a culture of bringing people in and basically holding them down by force for 3 days because we're that special and we're that far away, can't get out of Claremont so easily, right? And so I wanted to make sure I met you, but I also wanted to make sure that you got to know me a little bit. So I'll tell you something fantastic that recently happened to me. And for those of you, I hope this message reaches some of you because it definitely reached me. So a friend of mine said, you got to stop talking about goals and start talking about intentions. Like, I intend to do something, right? And I started doing that in my head, and then all of a sudden it became clear, like the steps in order to get to my intention became clear. So last May, I said, I intend to do something different with my life, right? I have 2 kids, I got the job, I needed to do something different. So I said, I intend to run a 5K in September. I know you're looking at the Angela Bassett body. I get it. You're wondering. Of course. So, a 5K. I said, I intend to run a 5K. What's 5K? 3 miles. Nothing. Right? But I got off my couch in May and decided to get one of those apps, like the From Couch to 5K apps, and started doing that and the workouts. It was totally embarrassing. And I'm the slowest person. I'm the slowest person on the planet. But I got out there every day, started doing my little runs, right? And then September rolls around, and I'm on Girls on the Run, and I do my 5K, right? Last week, I finished the LA Marathon. Right. 26.2 miles, very slow. But I crossed the line. I'm still dealing with the blisters on my feet. It took me 3 days to recover from walking like this and not being able to bend down and all. Yeah, it's hell. Don't do it. But, well, it's also 91 degrees. That's not helpful. Right? Now, I don't know when I intended to walk the LA Marathon, but somehow it happened. You know how you find yourself signing checks for something and you're like, what am I doing? And then you have to pay for it later. Well, that's what happened. And I'm not the kind of person, I never thought of myself as a runner, particularly athletic, as doing any of those things. So I want you to know I, after everything that Ernest said from my CV and my age, which is 35 plus, with all that I've done, I still have intentions and goals, right, that I want to fulfill in life. So that's a little exercise. Turn your goals into intentions. And it can really happen. It happened for me just last week, okay? So if I don't see you guys again, the students tomorrow, if you walk away with that message, I'd be very, very happy. Yeah? All right, so let's get to the talk. Okay, so now you can start the 45 minutes. So again, thank you so much for having me here. Oh, because that was 45 minutes? I'm sorry. Oh, see, my timer was going off. They're saying, girl, we need to do this. Okay. No, 15 hours and 45 minutes is not going to do it. All right, let's start. Before I begin, though, I would like to dedicate this talk to two of our own who have recently crossed. First, I need to thank and remember Teresita Martinez-Verge, a social historian par excellence, who advanced the study of the 19th century Spanish-speaking Caribbean, especially Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. I'm not sure about this, but reading and making suggestions for revisions of my book manuscript may have been the last piece of academic work that Teresita did, and I remember having conversations with her that summer. And I know that it took just a great amount of energy for her to read my manuscript despite her illness and to make revisions. She invested so much in me professionally and personally, and I hope I'm a better historian for it. Secondly, I want to dedicate this presentation in memory of Guy Alexandre, former ambassador of Haiti to the Dominican Republic, an intellectual, and in my mind, an anciano in the Hostosian sense of the word. Guy was such a gracious man whom I had the pleasure of meeting in Santo Domingo in 2010 at the first meeting of the Transnational Española Conference held at the Pedro Francisco Bono Institute. As Silvio Torres Sagan put in an email with Guy's death, we have lost an irreplaceable voice of reason in Hispaniola, a man of learning and caring, known for his gravitas and for being a caballero in the best sense of the word. Some of you in the audience may have noticed that my presentation pays homage to the title of the classic compilation of Hostos' work edited by the Trujillo-era historian Emilio Rodriguez de Morizzi, titled Hostos en Santo Domingo, first published in 1939 in commemoration of Hostos' centenary. The organizing board, which oversaw the memorial to Hostos that year, included former collaborators such as Federico Enriquez y Carvajal, former students such as Julio Peinado and Fabio Fiao, and a commission of damas who organized school events and an essay competition of and about Dominican women. With the exception of Carmen Gonzalez, Viuda Peinado, all of the women who served on this board were maestras normales, or normalistas. And many of them would have been taught by another woman who herself had graduated or had been taught by a graduate of the Young Women's Institute, founded by Eugenio María de Hostos and Salomé Ureña de Enriquez in Santo Domingo in 1884. By inserting "and the woman question" in parentheses then, I want to highlight how tangible yet almost invisible was Hostos' influence on Dominican women's education, female activism, and feminism. In 1941, and with the heavy-handed guidance of General Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican Republic's principal feminist organization, Acción Feminista Dominicana, Dominican Feminist Action, which included many of the women on the Hostos Commemoration Board, ceased to exist as such and became instead the feminine wing of the Trujillo Party, the Dominican Party. As with everything else during the Trujillato, Dominican feminism became a part of the regime, incorporated into the bureaucratic functions of the state, of an authoritarian state at that, and reimagined as belonging to the new era and to the new history forged by Trujillo himself. As a result, Dominican feminist origins and the educational reforms promulgated by Hostos and others, its ties to social reform efforts that date back to the 1880s, and most important, its philosophical debt to Hostos, were practically erased from the historical record. Therefore, my presentation this afternoon is part of a larger effort to rewrite the history of Dominican feminism, although today my focus will somewhat be on feminism, but how Hostos and then a generation of normalistas responded to the woman question in the Dominican Republic during the last quarter of the 19th century into the first decades of the 20th. Here we go. This is what I'm telling you to do. 1. I will begin with a brief summary of the social, political, and economic context of the Dominican Republic, where Hostos visited in 1975 and where he lived from 1879 until 1888, and then again from 1900 until his death in 1903. Then I will detail how Hostosian thought influenced the lives and activism of 3 female educators, La Doctora Evangelina Rodriguez, Petronila Angelica Gomez, and Ercilia Pepin, in order to gauge Hostos' significance to Dominican feminism and women's activism. In the last part of the presentation, I asked and hopefully answered 2 questions. Why did the woman question emerge in Santo Domingo? And what significance did women have in Hostos' thinking about civil society, the state, and the nation? To answer the first question requires that we place our analysis of Hostos within the well-established feminist historiography of gender in Latin American state formation, in which gender and state formation are understood as mutually constitutive processes. In answering the second, though, I suggest that we consider how the racial politics of anti-mismo and anti-imperialist activism inform Hostosian gender values. Hostos arrived in the Dominican Republic at an auspicious moment in the country's history, characterized by political upheavals, profound economic transformations, and threats to its sovereignty by the United States, a growing imperialist power in the Circum-Caribbean region. Why is this period between 1870 and 1900-ish so important in Dominican history? A generation of Dominican scholars of the Nueva Ola, the so-called new wave of historians from the late 60s, from the 70s, have argued the War of Restoration from Spanish annexation from 1863 to 1865 initiated a process inherently imperialist. According to the scholarly consensus, racial anti-colonial struggle that galvanized the island's Black and Mulatto majority challenged racism and imperialism. The war, as Emilio Betances argues, quote, established the basis for a bourgeois democratic republic ruled by merchants, intellectuals, artisans, business owners, and Black men, such as and change to emerge with an eye toward economic and social development. However, liberal unity, political cohesiveness proved ultimately elusive, because one of the things that the War of Restoration did was militarize Dominican society, right? You had a social insurgency that depended on mobilizing bands of men, for the most part, across different areas of the country, and these groups did not just go home and go away, and the arms didn't leave either. So one of the results of the Restoration War was militarizing Dominican society, which also meant that political disputes became violent or were violently dealt with, right? So that explains much of the violence and the chaos of the period of the Second Republic, 1865 to 1882, just when you have what some historians say is this effort to create a more liberal bourgeois democratic republic. The 2 major political parties that arose during this period, the Partido Rojo, which represented the interests of southern or southeastern landowners, and the Partido Azul, the Liberal Party, was dominated by more of the northern, from Santiago to Puerto Plata elites. Conservatives were represented by Buenaventura Valles, who served as president of the Republic from 1868 to 1874, actually the country again, but this time as a protectorate of the United States. After that effort failed, the presidency of the Republic changed hands over 30 times, switching between the 2 main parties and then among separate factions within those principal groups, right? Military juntas and ended with the dictatorship of General Ulysses Euro from 1888 to 1899. And one of the reasons why Hostos, probably the principal reason why Hostos left the Dominican Republic in 1888 was as a result of Euro's dictatorship. Economic changes only intensified the political divisions the Dominican Republic experienced between 1870 and 1900. In 1876, refugees from Cuba's 10 Years' War injected money and new technology into the aging sugar mills around San Pedro Macorís and Santo Domingo, and initiated a political, economic, and social revolution. Between 1876 and 1900, thousands of acres of forest were razed to make room for cane plantations. Wrought iron buildings that housed steam-driven mills towered over this cane-transformed landscape that churned out unrefined sugar that was later exported to the United States for refining. By the 1880s, mechanized sugar production was a dominant economic activity in San Pedro. For example, 7 sugar estates transformed the entire province into the Dominican Republic's main sugar-producing area. By 1908, sugar production was second only to cacao, and by then had far outpaced tobacco, which for much of the 19th century was second only to cacao in terms of agricultural export. By the end of the United States military occupation from 1916 to 1924, sugar would become the Dominican Republic's most important agricultural export. And Hostos, interestingly enough, did not shy away from making comments and publishing critiques in his new home about what he saw that was going on. Hostos worried about mechanized sugar production in the Dominican Republic for a couple of reasons. As he wrote, quote, "The sugar industry from a historical point of view is abominable because it was forged in slavery. And this, although the sugar industry in the Dominican Republic was not so much forged in slavery like it had been in Cuba and Puerto Rico, Hostos was troubled by some of those legacies, right? Especially when one result of mechanized sugar production was contractual labor migration from Haiti and other Eastern and Eastern Caribbean islands, Nevis, St. Kitts, of Black workers to the Dominican Republic. So that also troubled him. He was also troubled by what he felt that the Antilles were not prepared to sustain a sugar industry and also protect their national sovereignty. Right? And that also was quite prescient and correct, because what would end up happening is the United States had occupied Cuba, was in charge, had a colony in Puerto Rico, and occupied the Dominican Republic as well. And so in terms of his larger project of building the Antillean Federation, Hostos did not see how mechanized sugar production would help the Caribbean countries get to that point, because the mechanized sugar production undermined national sovereignty. However, the Dominican Republic was important for Hostos, both in his thinking about the Antillean Confederation and for his larger educational work. In part because Dominicans had defeated Spain in 1865, and their defeat of Spanish troops undoubtedly encouraged Cuban insurgents who 3 years later, in 1868, started their own insurgency against Spain. And when that war ended, much later, in 1878, political exiles from both Puerto Rico and Cuba, so Ramon Emeterio Betances, Antonio Maceo, I don't know if he was around Turks and Caicos for a little bit, but certainly received support from Dominicans in Puerto Plata. And of course, Hostos himself, find themselves in the Dominican Republic continuing to mobilize against Spanish imperialism. And in the Dominican Republic, they received money, they received materiel, strategic help, and also sanctuary, particularly in the northern city of Puerto Plata. As Hostos wrote in a letter to Luperón, he believed that the Dominican Republic played a key role in an Antillean confederation, having produced men like Luperón and General Máximo Gómez, who fought in just about every Cuban war of independence, right? In 1868, and then went back in 1895 to complete the work. Quote, sons of Santo Domingo by birth and sons of the Antilles by choice. In another letter, he noted that the Dominican Republic was the natural center for the conceptualization, for action, for meeting, and for executing the plans for building that Antillean Confederation. Why? In part, Hostos argued in an article titled Quisqueya, Quote, when it came time to expel Haitians, Dominicans built a government of equals for whites, blacks, mestizos, without whites resisting the political elevation of mestizos and blacks, and without those mestizos and blacks displeasing white men as their bosses. I know, hold on. In other words, the Dominican Republic modeled a racial democracy that white and black former insurgents in Cuba were in the process of naming and creating ideologically in the wake of their defeat in the 10 Years' War. I'll return to some of that, the white bosses, later. Okay, I heard it too. So we're going to get back to that at the end of the presentation. But to summarize, the 19th century, the Dominican Republic in the 19th century that Hostos knew was undergoing an extraordinary amount of change, all the while being challenged by political disunity, the resolution of which often became or ended violently. How would it be possible to bring fractured governing elites together? How could national unity be forged and Dominican sovereignty protected as regional economies became more pronounced and known, one for sugar production or cacao or tobacco, so that even the National Economic Development Program was being fractured, right? And this is where, as Francisco Antonio Avelino Garcia argues, Hostosian thought played an important role as an ideological glue among all these different factions of governing elites, of educated, of the literado, right, of the educated class, at a time of division, fissure, and fraction throughout the nation. The Dominican Republic's unruly and uneducated peasant majority provided the perfect symbol of the barbarity that needed to evolve into a civilized, governable population thanks to education, social development, through clubs and voluntary organizations, and whitening through migration and biological mixture. As I will now discuss, including women in the work of developing the Dominican nation, of helping it move from the darkness of barbarity into the light of civilization, became central to that unifying ideology for a generation of an educated governing elite. So far, I've given you the political, economic outline, but I still haven't really touched on the social. What was going on socially in the country? And what about the woman question, as I promised before? As I mentioned, Dominican historians regard the War of Restoration as the start of modern, a number of them, not all of them, as the start of modern Dominican nation state formation, because the war helped bring new actors into the political sphere. However, there's a great need for more social historical analysis of both the Spanish annexation period and the War of Restoration itself to understand the depth of this change. I've already described the decades after the war as especially chaotic and violent, so if the war had renewed in some Dominicans a sense of purpose of their national destiny, where was it and who held it? So I've got some preliminary answers based on years of research in the Dominican archives. So here's what I can say, so get ready. The War of Restoration did something. That's about it. And that something is evidenced in letters written by Dominicans who lived throughout the country, San Pedro, Santo Domingo, Santiago, and Puerto Plata. Often these men signed and addressed their letters ciudadano, citizen. Citizen so-and-so to citizen so-and-so. And dated them in el año tal de la restauración, in the 2nd, in the 5th, in the 10th year of the Restoration. These formulaic elements within a great deal of the correspondence written in the post-war period suggest two things. A kind of social leveling may have taken place, such that all men became ciudadanos. And second, that those ciudadanos felt completely entitled and empowered to represent their interests and make demands on other men who govern. And it appears that there were some women who were similarly inspired to act as ciudadanos or ciudadanas, even though they could not vote or run for elected office, but they could run schools, as was the case of Socorro Sanchez. Socorro Sanchez, born in 1830, was a member of a family that included some of the most important political figures of the 19th century, like Francisco de Rosario Sanchez, a Trinitario, or a leader of the rebellion against President Mujica in 1844, and Maria Trinidad Sanchez, who was executed by Pedro Santana for her political opposition to annexation in 1861. Socorro, as some would have us believe, quote, did not enter politics, but made her patriotic contribution through female education. In 1870, she opened a school, Colegio Corazón de María, and later in 1875, she established Colegio Altagracia, that by 1888 offered courses in pharmacy. In one letter that we have of hers written to Santiago City Council, Socorro Sanchez requested more time to prepare and give exams as a result of her poor state of health. And I love the fact that she began that letter with Ciudadanos, right? Ciudadanos. So she's placing herself, right? Citizens, and claiming that for her. Socorro Sanchez may have raised the woman question through her commitment to female education, and as this one letter suggests, by her insistence on addressing the city council as equal ciudadanos. I want to suggest then that when Hostos returned to the Dominican Republic in 1879, where he remained until 1888, some important groundwork might have already occurred that made female education and the visible participation of some women in the public sphere acceptable. Indeed, Ramonina Reyes de Castillo argues that by the time Hostos arrived in Santo Domingo, governing elites such as Gregorio Luperón, among other male liberals, had already developed, on paper at least, a public education system that would, quote, institute mechanisms for creating a social and cultural vision of the Dominican community that would include women. Luperón himself once wrote that la condición moral de un pueblo depende sobre todo de la educación de la familia, resultando que la educación de la mujer debe ser considerada como una cuestión de importancia nacional. Do you get that? So that women's education is an important national question because the entire moral condition of the community depends on an educated family, and family being at the center of that. Instruir a la mujer, and this is Luperón. It sounds really like Hostos, so you gotta wonder if he and Hostos had some conversations in 1875 in Puerto Plata about this. Instruir a la mujer es instruir al hombre. Instructing woman is instructing man. Elevar el carácter de la una es elevar el del otro. Ensanchar la libertad de mujer es asegurar la de toda la comunidad. And so, again, teaching women is to teach men. Elevating her character elevates his. Cultivating liberty, women's freedom, if you want to call that autonomy, assures that of the entire communities. For those of you more well acquainted with Hostos' writings than I am, you most likely feel that Luperón's reflections resonate and probably copies those of the maestro, suggesting that, again, Luperón may have read Hostos or conversed with him on this very topic. It wasn't simply that Hostos advocated for women's education that made his response to the woman question revolutionary. As Lucia Gerba Cunningham argues, Hostos recognized that patriarchy sustained false binaries between public and private spheres, reason and sentiment, relegated women to the private sphere, and reduced women to their biological roles, basically as breeders with a big heart and a small brain. Indeed, Gerba Cunningham insists Hostos elevated women to a superior moral position, suggesting that the work of bringing about civilization and progress to the nation would be impossible without female input. For his part, Leonidas Santos y Vargas characterizes Hostos' response to the woman question as feminist, if by feminism we mean being conscious of women's subordinate state and being committed to struggling against that injustice. Education was seen as the vehicle for eradicating women's subordination. Hostos is also feminist, he insists, this is the scholar, because Hostos himself argued that neither marriage nor motherhood were women's culminating acts as human beings. He applauded women's independence, women's autonomy. Most important, it is in Santo Domingo in 1881 that Hostos made the connection between women's status and colonialism. According to Hostos, both women and the colonies suffered from the triple slavery brought about by religion, brought about by the political situation of colonialism, and economic subordination. So you should have a handout that includes key quotes mostly from Hostos, La Educación Científica de la Mujer, although I think, no, that's right. Okay. Except quotation number 6 actually comes from a discourse on the first investiture of normalistas, graduates from the Salome Oreña, the Institute of the Señoritas in Santo Domingo. Okay, so whether or not Hostos is a feminist, we can go on debating that point. I'm not particularly interested not so much I'm not interested, but the kind of way that we define feminism, imposes a very presentist, that is, a very contemporary definition on a historical figure that may or may not fit that historical figure's understanding, right, of women's subordination or women's liberation from that subordination. But whether or not Hostos is feminist is one kind of question, but what is true is that his writings were very central to the development and origins of feminism in the Dominican Republic. And now I want to understand why. And some, as you read through the quotes, don't have time to read through all of them. I did not translate them from the Spanish. I and don't want to translate them from the Spanish because it'd be very difficult. And I'm not qualified. I'm not a philosopher in that sense to do that. And there's also just writes beautifully in Spanish as well. And the English would really kill it. But if those of you who But those of you who can read Spanish, please read the select quotes, and I will refer to some of them shortly. So an important text, of course, is La Educación Científica de la Mujer, published in 1873, in response to the furor that erupted in Chile over female instruction there. In that work, Hostos distanced himself significantly from other Latin American and European positivists of his time, when he insisted that women and men were equally rational beings. That was a big one. Women were rational. That Spanish colonialism and contemporary Moors had left women in the unnatural state of ignorance, that the culmination of female humanity lay not only within marriage and motherhood, but in her individual fulfillment as an autonomous woman, as an autonomous social actor. And that is key to Hostos's ideas. It should also be noted, and again, you'll have other people coming through this year to talk about this much better than I can, the relationship between Hostos's ideas about women as it connects to his larger ideas about social organization as such, and his definition of humanity. What was the purpose of our being here, right? The woman question, connects to those larger issues as well. Even though that is a key text, I tend to think that other writings of Hostos published in Dominican magazines and newspapers when he returned to the Dominican Republic might have been more available and accessible to educated Dominicans than perhaps even La Educación Científica de la Mujer, and I can't really prove that the way I would like to. Most, if not all, of those essays can be found in the collection Hostos in Santo Domingo. For example, in an article, La Escuela Normal, published in Santo Domingo's La Actualidad in 1879, Hostos applauded the efforts of some officials in the Dominican government to organize a lay school system, at the heart of which was training teachers. But why? In a country where not even most of the population could access basic education, would you focus on training teachers? And he said, basically, because you need precisely those teachers who know the social context of the Dominican Republic, who are instructed in the rational scientific method of teaching, to go out and do the work, to build the educational system that you want. And he basically said, La escuela normal forma maestros. El maestro se ha de formar parte para la determinada sociedad donde funciona. And that was his, that the teachers will work in their social context. The spread of such a school system throughout the country would be impossible without the sacrifice of normalistas. In another article written in 1901, El Normalismo en la Vida Nacional, Hostos decried the closure of the Normal Institute, as he wrote, su perversa destrucción, and proclaimed that normalismo represented los fines y propósitos de la civilización. It represented the ends, and the proposal of bringing civilization. And he also writes, La escuela normal, the normal school, concluyó por conquistar el respeto y el cariño de la sociedad urbana. So it ended having earned, the respect and the cariño, the love, of urban society, in which so many normalistas worked to make education a priority in the cities where they lived. The basis of this success was la vida fraternal que llevaban los niños en la escuela, la increíble facilidad con que la escuela formaba maestros y discípulos, el continuo trabajar de cada profesor en hacer cada vez más activa la inteligencia de sus discípulos o sus alumnos. This is exactly what a lot of your professors are trying to do here. at Hostos, I think, right? Continuous work of your professors to activate and engage your intelligence and to grow it, right, as your students. The close-knit society that Hostos described as inherent within the work of normalismo was certainly experienced by female normalistas as well. And this becomes clear in his 1887 speech at the first graduation of normalistas from the Instituto de Señoritas, a part of which you have cited as number 6 under Hostos. Hostos's quotes. And he left them with very clear instructions. Go and be teachers of the truth, of the proven and demonstrated truth. Be formadoras, right? Foment reason, complete and healthy reason. Be escultoras like sculpture, sincere spirits. Educate la sensibilidad. Para enseñarla a solo amar lo bello, to teach others to love that which is beautiful when it is good. To educate the will to do the work of civilization and bring progress to the country. That is a lot to do, but that's the message that he left with those normalistas. Okay, so again, you can look at the quotes to get a larger sense of where Hostos stood in terms of his ideas about education. But why did this all matter? And what happened to it once it became on the ground, basically? Well, a few women, or several women, graduated from the Instituto de Señoritas. One of them was Ana Caona Moscoso de Puello, who returned to her hometown of San Pedro de Macorís, where she founded another institute for young women, which she called the Salomé Ureña Institute for Young Women. And at the urging of two poets, Gaston and Rafael de Linque, she was encouraged to take on a student who was born to unwed parents and sold sweets on the street of San Pedro de Macorís, who had become the first Dominican woman licensed to practice medicine, and that was Evangelina Rodriguez. Evangelina Rodriguez attended the Salomé Ureña Institute in San Pedro. She graduated the same year as Hostos' death in 1903. She attended medical school in Santo Domingo, but returned to San Pedro in 1907 to direct the institute after her dear teacher, Ana Caona, died in childbirth. While teaching in San Pedro and completing her medical degree, Rodriguez wrote a text, Granos de Polen, which shows a profound influence of Hostos in her thinking, in addition to some eugenics in her thinking as well, and we can talk about that too. Rodriguez insisted, for example, that educated people were responsible for curing the poor of their indolence. This was possible because our masses are not instinctively perverse. They are immoral for lack of education. And for those of you who know Hostos' work, you can hear some of the resonances there. She advocated for a reimagined Dominican household under the care of conscientious mothers, because the family, the household, was the nation's incubators. Therefore, women's domestic laborers were critical to national development. Following Hostos, however, she stressed some of the naturalness of biological differences between men and women. For instance, although she encouraged women to provide the masses with conscientious direction, she warned them not to emasculate their husbands with their intellects. Don't even think about it ever. This is her. Do not upbraid him, because it would be like robbing him of the only thing he has. Okay. Yeah. Gotta love Rodriguez. So Rodriguez's text treats all Dominican women as potential normalistas, and her view of Dominican society is quite optimistic, right? Things can change. You know, even though it's somewhat eugenics inflected in some of her social work later, but things can change, and the change factors are educated women and a reimagined Dominican household. She became, in San Pedro de Macorís, Rodriguez helped advocate for poor women and their children. One of the first organizations mentioned in the City Council minute was the Women's League for the Protection of Infancy, a group of women dedicated to social service. Dr. Rodriguez was also very much interested in women's reproductive care and provided contraception to Dominican women at a time when that was not easily available, raised funds to purchase milk, equipment, to fund her clinics throughout the city, and advocated, fought with the city council for building a maternity hospital, which it finally did in 1929. So that's some of the fruits of the labor of Hostos out of Rodriguez. Although Dr. Rodriguez did not appear to have joined any formal feminist organizations, her contemporary Petronila Angelica Gomez did. Petronila Angelica Gomez was another woman of color, born in 1872 or 1873, a natural child, that is born out of wedlock, who, like Evangelina Rodriguez, also achieved extraordinary social mobility by becoming, in 1910, the principal of San Pedro's first co-educational school. Petronila went on to found the first feminist magazine in the Dominican Republic called Femina in 1922, and in 1923 organized the Dominican branch of the Liga Internacional de Mujeres Ibéricas Hispanoamericanas, the International League of Iberian and Hispanic American Women, and presided over the Liga Feminista de la República Dominicana, the Feminist League of the Dominican Republic. At the same time, another kind of feminist organization was coming into being in Santo Domingo out of Club Nosotras, which was founded in 1927. In 1931, Club Nosotras would become Acción Feminista Dominicana. What's interesting about Gomez and her feminist vision was that it was also shaped by U.S. military occupation, so that her call to female activism was also accompanied by a call to resist foreign rule. As she wrote in the first issue of Femina, quote, "We had conceived the purpose of publishing this magazine so that, working for national unity, it could offer wide berth to Dominican women so that this powerful agent, Femina, would produce, without even the tiniest hindrance, fruitful and beneficial action." For Gomez, women's activism had two objectives: to create a civilized citizenry and to assist men in ending the occupation. The country needs our practical service. In this great hour of moral social unrest, rise up, Dominican woman, and come to help your companion man. Today is the day to cooperate with him in that great work of social improvement. In some ways, Gomez's feminism also picks up with the anti-imperialism that also is threaded through Hostosian thought, particularly concerning the Antillean Confederation. But she also made sure to say that Latin feminists were different from European or North American feminists. Quote, "Latin feminism conserves women as essentially women within the home, educating their children and sharing with their partner preoccupations and happinesses, assisting them as brothers and compatriots in all that is within their power, in harmony and with their character and condition as women, and assuring the true constitutive peace of the home. Latin women place the greatest emphasis in their lives on the charm of always keeping live the flame of love, nourished by that natural affinity that, when not manifest in its full intensity, is reflected in the diverse and attractive shades of sympathy." So we can discuss that a little bit later too, right? What she meant by Latin feminism and how that was positioned against what she saw as European and North American feminism. But in the context of U.S. occupation, this would make a lot more sense. I would like to point out, though, that her characterization of the family resonates with Hostos's arguments about the family and society at large, particularly as he described in the Moral Social. The Moral Social, among other things, was a philosophy of nation building. And Hostos defined the Moral Social in contrast to religious-based conceptualizations of morality. Rather than deriving its legitimacy from religious doctrine, social morality emerged through conscientious learning and the application of the principles of natural law to society. At the heart of this new moral society that we were supposed to build was the family, because the family, in Hostos's thinking, completed, quote, the biological tie with the sociological, the moral bond with the juridical, and perfected the natural and legal dependency of inferiors on superiors. It was an expression of natural law, the basis of which society was supposed to build itself. So Gomez is also picking up, in her understanding of Latin feminism, domesticity, and all of that, elements, I think, there in Hostos's thought as well. But perhaps one of the most important elements that come out of Gomez, but also Ercilia Pepin, this feminist and normalista from Santiago, is anti-imperialism. Ercilia Pepin, again, feminist and normalista, began a one-woman anti-occupation campaign giving lectures in Santo Domingo, La Vega, Santiago, and Puerto Plata shortly after the invasion. Her commitment to anti-imperialism was reflected in her refusal to accept her selection as the Dominican Republic's official delegate to the Pan-American Association for the Advancement of Women Conference held in Baltimore in 1922. It would be a special honor, she wrote to the military government, but the abnormality of our true national life has been profoundly altered for the past 5 years. In other words, thank you, I am not going to go, as a protest of the occupation. In another gesture of her commitment to anti-imperialist activism, Pepin and her students sent an embroidered Nicaraguan flag to Augusto Sandino in 1928 in fraternal solidarity with his struggle to liberate Nicaragua from US control. In response, Sandino demonstrated a deep appreciation for Pepin and her students in a letter calling the flag, quote, a sign that there is unity of thought among the American peoples against Yankee imperialism. Therefore, while it might be problematic for us today to ascribe to Hostos feminist values that he may not have subscribed to himself, right? It is very much the case that normalismo as an idea of social engagement and the practice of teaching, organizing, and running schools provided a generation of educated, upwardly mobile Dominican women the necessary intellectual tools and organizational strategies with which to cultivate activist networks. Some of these networks remain in the hands of women reformers, while other networks became consciously feminist and anti-imperialist. As for the post-restoration period, we need much more social historical research and analysis to assess normalismo's impact in other urban centers and the associational lives of educated Dominicans throughout the national territory. Are you hearing that I keep saying we need social historical research? That's a big hint, people. I want some of you to be those social historical researchers to answer these questions. That's what we need. Even as feminists became named as such, however, they did not initially demand juridical equality or suffrage, which put them at odds with European and North American feminists who had recently, by the 1920s, made some gains in those areas. Perhaps these political limits were imposed on these activists by the historical context. Can you imagine the strategic faux pas it would have been for Dominican feminists to hold up the United States as a model of female progress as US Marines occupied Dominican National Territory? That would have been strategically insane. So they did it. Or maybe these limits resulted from the tensions and contradictions within normalismo itself. As I will argue in the conclusion, responses to the woman question, especially some of those tensions, in thinking about the woman question, were shaped by the question itself, specifically by the set of related political dilemmas that informed the question's genesis in the first place. And now I'm concluding. Okay. So we go from the social, historical, political context of the Dominican Republic. We've talked about a little bit about Hostos, his influence on education. You have a series of quotations and a lot of quotes. So you see there's a great deal of information out there that you can reconstruct the history of Hostos's influence on women's social reform movements and then later on feminism itself. Now I want to think about Hostos and gender in Latin America, again, hopefully getting to the so what question. The feminism I described so far, from San Pedro, Santo Domingo, highlights the comfortable alliance, it seems, between female activism and nationalist modernizing projects, of which Hostos was clearly a central figure in Dominican ideologies regarding progress and civilization from the late 19th century until at least the end of the United States military occupation in 1924. And in my book, I think I argue that the transition is really made into the 1940s because we have some of Hostos's own students who become some of the intellectual architects of the Trujillato in a later period. With hindsight, we can pinpoint the failures. Although witty and acerbic critics of U.S. occupation, these early feminists did nothing to address the male monopoly over political power. Then again, in a context where armed conflict over political power was the norm, feminist demands to rise above the political fray appear to have been reasonable responses to a conflictive situation lacking obvious solutions. In other words, the feminist claim that we are not political may not have just been the sellout as it appears to be initially. actually, that in fact they were trying to do something more profound, move beyond the political, because the political space itself was too contentious and violent. And while they themselves could have been, and in the case of Dr. Rodriguez, was ridiculed for not modeling ideal gender roles, their feminist theory reinforced gender-based hierarchies within the family, even as they reimagined a Dominican household free from the winds of ignorant patriarchal authority. So what do we do with this legacy? And what does this history teach us that is relevant for the present? Okay, I'm going to jump like 80 years. As I mentioned at the beginning, I believe these are legacies we have to grapple with. Because the very question, the woman question, did not emerge from thin air, but from the very messy and contentious work of nation building, state formation, and economic development. As feminist scholars are arguing right now, neoliberal policies, particularly the rescinding of the social net in many countries going through privatization and globalized economies, and contemporary economic development policies authorized by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, presume heteronormative family structures, and when these are not present, fund projects to produce them, such as programs directed at men to become better fathers, and implicitly rely on women's unpaid labor, unpaid reproductive labor, to bridge ever-increasing gaps between stagnant and low wages and the absence of government subsidies to help with basic foodstuffs, education, and healthcare. In our contemporary moment, it is clear that adding gender to the mix, that is, raising the woman question in the arena of development, has only added to women's burdens. It is not necessarily about liberating them from the exigencies of contemporary globalization and neoliberal politics. I believe something similar was the case in the 19th century as well. Because then as now, the woman question was not simply meant to address the absence of women in the political sphere, because it didn't bring them into the political sphere as voters, as full citizens, and it didn't even make them political actors. As we have seen in the Dominican Republic, the goal was to make educated women companions to educated men in the work of bringing about progress and civilization to a backward country. It may be then that the woman question was not about women at all, but emerged as a way to address more troubling problems within the nationalist development paradigm at that particular historical moment. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I want to suggest that we place the Dominican Republic's contribution within the broader narrative of Latin American women's and gender history. In that scholarship, we asked, why did the women's question emerge in the first place? And why did the state, or in this case, a group of educated elite men, accept changing gender roles as a social good rather than as a threat to traditional norms that, as some would argue, and some did argue back then, were necessary to uphold given the variety of changes Latin American societies experienced in the period between 1870 and 1940? Why accept an official politics of gender in which women were regarded as complements to male power? This scholarship suggests possible clues. Elizabeth Dorr, in her analysis of Latin America's long 19th century, finds that Latin American states moved on a number of fronts to normalize elite, predominantly male ideals of femininity and masculinity. This normalization provided the opportunity for national, regional, and local officials to exert pressure on men and women to conform to what the elite regarded as proper behavior. To some degree, Hostos falls into this category because much of his discussion around normalismo and women's roles as educated within the household ends up idealizing a new norm regarding marriage. And marriage is anchored in equal partnerships, in romantic love, and characterized by families with clearly delineated roles for mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. As Dora points out, this differentiation of gender roles within the family was new to the lower classes. The upper class family model was detrimental to the poorer sectors of society, especially because it delegitimated a gamut of women's traditional economic activities outside the home. Again, it may be that the focus on the woman question was less about women than about recreating the family around a new set of norms as a different class stood poised to become politically dominant in the post-Restoration Dominican Republic. Maxime Molyneux also argues that in the early decades of the 20th century, and as a result of specific economic changes, Latin American women were not, for the most part, excluded from national projects. They became more visible parts of them. And their feminism reflected both their increased visibility and the resiliency of certain norms. As Molyneux points out, the principle of sex difference among Latin American feminists, they accepted it, but they did not accept it as a basis for unjustified discrimination. They embrace ideologies of civic maternalism in their push for political and civil rights, thus highlighting gender differences and couching feminist demands as stemming from women's natural roles as mothers, rather than originating in a sense of women as autonomous political activists. Therefore, the difference between Latin feminism that Petronila talked about and presumably European and North American feminism resonates with feminist theories produced elsewhere throughout Latin America that linked motherhood with women's rights. And again, the woman question in this instance had less to do with regarding women as autonomous political actors and is more concerned with managing political spaces that opened as a result of modernity itself, and the ways in which immigration, the expansion of the working class, urbanization, industrialization, the marriage of science and social policy, war, etc., the rise of mass societies, all affected political change in the early 20th century. At the same time, if we take seriously the notion of gender, race, and class as interlocking systems of oppression following Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins, among others, then although not explicitly named, the woman question is connected to the race question. And this is true not only for the Dominican Republic, but for the rest of Latin America as well. Just think for a minute about the laudatory language with which Hostos and his followers describe women and their positive attributes. Until now, I have not yet seen similar characterizations of African-descended men or women in Hostos's writings, even when he was one of the architects of Pan-Antillean thought. Indeed, given the ascendancy of scientific racism in the 19th century, which was often used to justify the exclusion of African-descended men from political power across the hemisphere, and justify violence against their attempts to mobilize politically, isn't it rather odd that there's a silence around race and racism as an enormous obstacle in building the Antillean Confederation he so very much wanted? Instead, elaborated in the late 1880s and 1890s, Pan-Antillean thinkers such as Luperon and Hostos insisted on the cultural, geographic, and racial cohesion of the people of the Greater Antilles. In the quote, this is Luperon, in the Greater Antilles, I think, there is a nationality so natural. Cuba, Jamaica, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico are not only members of the same body, but parts of the same whole. And there's this expression about sometimes it's Cuba and Puerto Rico, sometimes it's Cuba and the DR, two wings, one bird, right? Luperon explicitly addressed race in his writings about Antianismo. For instance, Luperon countered perceptions of Haitians' blackness as opposed to Dominicans' race mixture or whiteness, because for him, Haiti and the Dominican Republic were sister nations not only out of necessity, but because they were the same people. He insisted that, quote, the island's population is formed by two races, the European and the African, which mixing as they have produced another mixed race. Also, there is race thinking threaded throughout Hostos's work, but is not made as explicit as in these examples from Luperon, and I'm mystified by that absence. He agreed with Luperon that the Caribbean's history had produced an interesting racial matrix that should be celebrated, not scorned. Yet the moral political subject of their creation, the Antiano, was raceless, neither white nor black, but Antillean, a new race, a new person. This is not to say that Hostos never thought about race in its political dimensions. I'm not saying that. It's there. And as I said, he considered in that one quote, the Dominican Republic emerges as a racial democracy, right? Which for some of us thinking about what's happening in the Dominican Republic today is kind of shocking, considering the contemporary. So this is not to say that Hostos ignored it, but and I would argue that his concerns about the racial composition of Caribbean countries and their possible impact on the future indeed bubbles up in some of his work. And there's a beautiful reflection, Orlando and I were talking about it in his journal, where he's sitting in a church, the Iglesia Episcopal de los Africanos, an AME church right here in New York City. And he has an epiphany about what he wants to see for Puerto Rico. And he says, this is it. I cannot support slavery in Puerto Rico, and there must be racial justice in Puerto Rico. It's a beautiful reflection that's written in his journal, and I have a copy if you'd be interested. So it's not that he didn't talk about it, but I'm wondering, it may be that taking on the woman question was a way to keep quiet the race question, as Antillean activists insisted on their and their nation's readiness for independence. Anti-Black racism remained dominant in intellectual and scientific discourses of the period. Even though the architects of a raceless Antillean ideal, or of Cuban racelessness for that matter, responded creatively and passionately and even radically to the white supremacist discourses of the period, concerns over if and whether black men would actually preside over these new nations were much harder to combat. As one historian has argued, the racelessness that was characteristic of the Dominican ideal type, and talking about the 19th century, pointed to insecurities regarding the racial makeup of the country. That unable to claim whiteness, Dominican intellectuals settled for directing attention to the racial mix that marked the population and playing down issues of race and political discourse. Francisco Antonio Avelino Garcia, scholar of Hostos, makes this point even more explicit, arguing that racism lay at the root of Hostos' concept of society, because according to Avelino, Hostos sin quererlo tal vez aceptaba implícitamente el evolucionismo social del cual el racismo es hijo legítimo. That the whole notion of social evolution, this is according to Avelino, at its root, that his implicit acceptance of social evolution brought in racism, because racism is the legitimate son of that idea. I don't know. The woman question, however, erupted into audible speech in a moment when the race question was silenced into racelessness. And I don't think that's mere coincidence. I think there's a connection there. In other words, it became possible to talk about new roles for women and women's equality with men, just as it was becoming impossible or more difficult to affirm the same for African-descended people and black political leadership in particular. Were women used as pawns to disenfranchise black men? I'm not sure I'd make that argument yet. Do we blame Hostos for all of this? Probably not. But it does appear that Hostos Luperon, among others, turned to the woman question to both legitimize their nationalist modernizing projects without reference to the threat of black political leadership, because that was always in the background. Also, naturalizing women's gender roles may have persuaded certain groups that the changes liberals demanded would not completely disrupt social order, since differences based on biological sex remained unchanged, even in the new political scenario. And this point here comes from scholarship, say, Eileen Suarez Finlay's work, Opposing Decency on Puerto Rico, where she talks about in moments of political crisis and political opening, sexuality, gender come in to naturalize and hierarchies, right? Particular gender hierarchies, male, female, senior, junior, even as other changes are taking place. But that if we know that the family or that womanhood and manhood are not going to be touched, somehow it makes us all feel better. Again, of course, my point here is not to blame Hostos for all of this. And I hope you don't hear that I'm judging him or his contemporaries harshly for the choices they made within their historical context. It is, however, our responsibility as scholars to take notice of how political change provokes social transformations that states and dominant elites manage, either by downplaying or naturalizing differences based on race or gender, or by glossing over class figures, or a combination of each of that. The woman question forms part of this very messy, contentious, but very interesting story. Thank you.
So I kind of like want to know, I mean, being that this is a feminist writing about women's studies and gender issues, Hostos would be a very good, yes, very good information that I'm interested in. Because
Beverly, you've opened up a can of worms. We're talking about the ways in which academia is structured politically of power. But okay, bullet points, 3 bullet points. Your question is so great. 1, is a lot of Hostos translated into English, first of all?
Yes.
There's an anthology that was translated. We have some on our website, a whole anthology that was done in 1991.
Okay.
And it's my memoir then, so his essays on women are not translated.
Are not translated. So that's the one
I'm working
issue.
on that.
Thank you. That's the one issue so is accessibility. Also, you have to, right, at this moment, be able to read Spanish and to be comfortable reading in Spanish. It's not like Shakespearean Spanish. It's not, Cervantes, but it's complicated. The other point that you raised is where are non-European, non-white feminist theorists in women's studies and gender feminist studies, right? So that even, I mean, to point out Black feminist theorists, Chicana Latina feminist theory, you know, Native American feminist theory, all of that, we have lots of good stuff coming from all of those groups. And also, and third, the U.S. Academy has very little space, almost no space, for Latin American philosophers, period. So we don't know anything about Hostos. We may read a poem or two of Martí, call it a day, and then, you know, everyone else is sort of, you get when you go there, you study abroad program, right? And you take that class. So you study abroad. So seriously, that's one. And actually, and I have to say for myself, I didn't have that background either. And then when I was on my Fulbright in DR at the institute where I was affiliated, I took classes with my colleagues. So Pablo Mega, who's a Jesuit priest who taught a class in Pensamiento Social Latinoamericano, which introduced me to this whole narrative of social philosophy in Latin America, the people I've never read before. That was my introduction. And then Raimundo Gonzalez, oh, I love him, and he taught a class, Pensamiento Dominicano, right? Classes you don't find in the U.S. Academy. So that's where it's missing. That's where your education has a gap. But it's not your fault, it's structural. Okay. It's a structural issue. It's about the U.S. thinking it's the only America, and it's not, right? There's a whole Americas, and its philosophical tradition, and its feminist theorizing. The U.S. isn't the only place where feminist theorizing happens. It isn't the only place where philosophy happens. But you're taught as if it's were. That's part of the reason why it's so important this whole year devoted to Hostos, to bring him into light and hopefully be accompanied by some translations into English of more of his work, because it's so important. Because you're right, you didn't know about it, and now you do, and it's great. Yes. Another student?
Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, how are you? Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Georgiana Echevarria. I'm an criminal justice student, and my professor is Professor Rosa Velasco here. This is my question. Everybody knows that the women really is reaching higher levels than before, right? Yeah. But why do you think there's some inconvenience, like some barriers that we're not more successful? Like, let's see, we don't have any president, we do have it, but we don't have more. We don't have more intellectuals, more professors. You know what I mean? Like, what do you think that we're not doing really good, or what we need to be more successful and to be more on point, more on top, like the world needs to recognize that we are powerful, that we got power, that we are courageous, that we're courageous. You know what I mean? So what do you think we need? Thank you.
Well, in my Marxist feminist days, I'd say we need socialism. We need subsidized and/or free childcare. Yeah. Right? We need to, because it's not only caring, reproductive work takes a lot of time. And children take a lot of resources. Right? And this is a question that feminists, not only Marxist feminists, socialist feminists, and others have been trying to figure out, because, say, the Cuban model was to bring more women into the workforce as a way to sort of liberate them from all these other issues. Didn't work. You just have more women working and more women doing more work, right? And without addressing, childcare, the cost that requires to raise children, et cetera. So there are a lot of issues that are structural, I think. And then I think there are some issues of gender typing and ideology that we still need to overcome. And I think one of them is captured by this notion of presumed incompetent. I think a lot of us as women, I even suffer from myself. I mean, I was sitting here kind of being embarrassed about my CV being read, but no guy would ever feel that way. And I'm thinking, why do I feel this way? That is on my CV. Darn it, I did that work, right? I got this stuff, right? But here I am thinking, I have people I know here listening to my talk, and I'm kind of, mortified. Like, why? Why do I feel that sort of stress? And I wonder if that also hinders women, because of our particular gender socialization and that notion of presumed incompetence, and just gaining our own confidence so that we can be very proud and strong in our voices. But yeah, it's a structural effort. Okay, another student? Yes? Yeah.
Their head?
Okay. Okay.
Well,
Okay, good. We're over. Thank you very much.
in the absence of a student question, let me just ask one of the first, I guess, faculty questions. You mentioned a clear differentiation between North American European feminism and Latin American feminism. And I think for many of the students, it's the first time they've heard that there is a difference. And you reference that the United States is not the only America. There's not only one definition of feminism. If you could talk a little bit more about these different types of feminism, and then I'm sure many of us can branch off on that when we bring our students back to our classes.
Okay, or correct me if I'm wrong, because there's a lot to that. So basically, in my historical research, I would read writings by North American feminists who tended to judge Latin American women. Oh, they're so religious, they're so Catholic, they're not going to get over their religiosity, they'll never support this, that, or the other because they're just caught up in their religious piety. They don't want the vote because they still maintain, this kind of gender identity. They didn't talk about it in that terms, but, machismo and patriarchal power are still very much part of their societies. And they really judged Latin American women harshly for basically not being like them, right? And not taking on, the issues that they thought were taking on. So in the 20s, 30s, so into the 40s, what's interesting about feminism in this period is that it's quite transnational and transhemispheric. So we have Dominican feminists in the pages of Femina reading articles written by Mexican feminists and Chilean feminists and Colombian feminists. And there is a sense of an Iberian, Hispanic, American feminism that's really captured in Petronila's argument about Latin American feminism conserves gender difference, basically conserves women as women and men as men. That we're not going to transform our gender identity to become more manly in order to get the rights that we think we deserve. And we don't want to justify anymore our subordination to, to men, patriarchal authority, but at the same time, we're not going to overturn, we accept these biological differences. So that's one key difference as Latin American women defined their feminism, as they perceived it from European and North American feminists, that they maintained that sex-gender difference, and they embraced it, and that was fine. So, and they felt that European and North American women did not do that. And that itself is also false perception, because there are also very different strains of North American and European feminism, some of which did maintain the kind of ideal of domesticity and certain ideals of womanhood, and that was in contentious, that was a contentious struggle. So that was one difference. Latin American feminists in the 1910s and teens and 20s were also very perplexed and then decided to be anti-imperialists. They could not stand by the U.S. coming in, intervening, invading, and occupying sovereign states. And so, again, their feminism quite early on engaged a critique of imperialism that we don't see in much of European and North American feminism until, yesterday, right? I mean, not yesterday, maybe 5 years ago. But seriously, a real good critique of settler colonialism, imperialism and feminism, imperialism and women's rights. Really, that critique is just coming up in white liberal feminism of the United States. Where it is in European feminism, I have no idea. But Latin American feminists had that critique because many of them were living in countries constantly invaded and occupied by the United States. So that's another significant difference. But where Latin American women were judged harshly, I think, happens to be in the sense that they, upheld women as women, men as men, the kind of difference feminism that I kind of talked about in the paper. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Thank you. Yes. Volunteer. Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Professor Jigger from the English department.
Yes.
And I find it interesting that he writes about women as having a specific role in the family, then go out to work. But he also supported women who wanted to be teachers and who established schools. So were these women not married, or how did they juggle having a profession and also having a family? Did he have anything to say about that?
No. The work-life balance? No. Yeah, so Evangelina Rodriguez never married, and there's some suggestion that she may even have been gay. We don't know quite for sure, but some oral history in San Pedro de Macorís does see her as a queer figure. We know that she was ridiculed for the kind of clothes she wears. She appears to have been somewhat managed in her, affect. Basically, again, this is all sort of shady oral history. That needs to be really unpacked, right? So that's one. Petronila Angelica Gomez married late, but for much of her activism was single. Salome Ureña was always married kind of late. And it's interesting, her poetry essentially stopped when she started having children, surprise. And then, as writing tends to stop when you have children. And then Silvia Pepin was not married. And so, yes, a lot of these normalistas, what's fascinating is, first of all, they go off and they run these schools, and the guys don't say much of anything about this, right? Which is kind of, transformative in terms of gender ideologies for that period in the Dominican Republic. Number two, a lot of these women run schools out of their own homes. And so it feels like Avon. It's like a home run business to have some of these schools, right? And it provides necessary income for a lot of single women. Whether or not they have children, I don't know. I haven't fleshed out all of the biographies of these. But, yeah, so a lot of them are single. They're running these schools. They're running them as businesses. They're getting income from them. They're also kind of this prestige of being the normalista. And those who are married, are able to do so. And I think because they have men who understand their labor as contributing to the national development picture. When I presented this work, or some of this work, at the Gender and History Conference in Santo Domingo, one of the leading Dominican feminists today, Magali Pineda, said, the stark difference she sees between then and now is that then the male leadership stood up for women. And she says, we don't have that now in the Dominican Republic. It's a very different intellectual, political world that Dominican feminists move in. So that the intellectual men, the elite men, were on board with this. And I think that also helps. But in terms of balancing all the work life and then the necessity and then everything, no. I mean, I think Ana Kaona is a good symbol and the tragedy of that. She had I think 5 or 6 children and was told by her doctor, please do not get pregnant again. She got pregnant and died in childbirth. And that, I think, influenced Rodriguez in terms of her contraception campaign because of the tragedy of her teacher's death.
You have a question here?
Hi. My name is Professor Vanessa Valdez. I'm actually across the river at State College, and I'm a professor of Latin American literature. So one of the things that you remind me of, well, you remind me of a number of things. Julia de Burgos, right, poet, teacher. Gabriela Mistral, poet, teacher, right? All of them were women who went out and were writing and were also formative in the creation of their states, the nation anyway. I wanted to ask you if you could please comment a little bit more about the racelessness question with regards to the formation of the Antillano. Because for me, it reminds me of Jose Marti's creation of that idea of the New America. Vasconcelos talking about La Casa Cósmica. Hemispherically, we have these ideas of we're nations that are mixed, and yet we're new. And that newness is never marked by a racial characteristic, right?
It's never blackness.
No, it's kind of beige, sort of. And also, I wanted to say to direct my comment to Beverly, all of what I just said you might be able to find in your Spanish classes, Latin American classes. I think one of the things at foreign language departments we don't do enough is we don't promote, oh yeah, we talk about the essay, and we talk about feminism, and we talk about history, and we talk about a number of things. It's just, most of our students go, oh, foreign language requirement, and they keep it moving. But all of that may be housed there. So.
Excellent point. Thank you for that. Racelessness. So, in the first chapter of my newly published book, so by that. No, because you're right. So I view, and I could be, I'm happy to have a conversation about this later with people who are more knowledgeable. For me, the Antiano stands as sort of the political horizon, the aspiration, right? Yeah. And for me, the Antiano is the Mambi turned full political subject. And that Antiano figure, as far as I can tell in my readings of Luperón and Hostos and others, is he is a new mestizo in a way. That's kind of mulatto-ish, but his reference is not blackness nor whiteness. Imari Reyes Santos, or I always get her name. Imari Reyes Santos, who you definitely should invite out here as a keynote. She has this wonderful couple articles in which she examines precisely the racistness question. And it's tough for us writing about this because everyone thinks racistness equals, oh, they're white supremacists and racists, right? When you don't talk about race, it must be because you're hiding something, which is true. But I don't want to put Luperón and Hostos in the same bag as Galvan, for example, or some of the other more, I don't want to put them together, and I don't think they're white supremacists. What Imari says is a really good point, that they both, and Betances is also in this, that all three of these men try to work through creating a political subject and end up creating one that is raceless so they can actually take race out of the picture in terms of you cannot justify oppression against this subject because he's neither white nor black. And in that way, it is a radical turn against white supremacist thinking of the period. But what she also says is that Luperón, for instance, still cannot imagine that political figure not having an anchor in some sort of civilizingness, which Luperón calls Hispanic tradition. So he's Hispanic, culturally, linguistically, in his outlook. And there are some moments of Luperón where you read him and I say, ooh, oh, Gregorio, why? He's talking about Haitians don't have good family structures, where the Spanish family is, where Spanish colonialism, not so bad, we owe so much good to Spain, and you're like, oh, really, please. But Imari, grapples with that a little bit and says, she almost points it's a failure of his political imagination rather than, his becoming white supremacist. He's not that. It's just he couldn't imagine that political figure not being anchored in some sort of Hispanic civilizing war, even as he's saying this is a raceless or a new race. To think of Haitian and Dominicans as creating something new as a new race. If we were to put that on a placard right now, protesting against, what the tribunal just did, can you imagine what the response to that would be, right? So that's race, and I think, and this is the stuff, more historical research is needed, where we have got to get people to sit down in wherever, in Puerto Plata, and see and imagine Betances, Hostos, Luperón, Euro de vez en cuando, a couple other people, exchanging letters, sitting down and thinking through some of this stuff, because I think it's interesting. Are they reading? They have to be reading Martí. They have to be reading each other. They have to be engaged in this broader conversation because, as you said, we see these ideas come up and over again throughout, the Americas, right? But people are beginning to do that work. We just don't have it yet to, put down, yes, in this moment, Luperón meets Betances says, hey, what about this idea of racism? Like that kind of historical analysis is what we need. But I think the Antillean race, this new race that he is, which doesn't signify blackness, doesn't signify whiteness, but references Hispanidad, Hispanicness, is in conversation with Cuban racelessness, which we'll see in formation, which is being, ideologically created in the 1880s, as Ada Ferrer points out in Insurgent Cuba, the silence between the wars and preparation for, the next, insurgency. So it is very, very interesting, and we just need much more work on that.
Thank you. I am becoming conscious of the time, and more food has arrived, so there's more questions. Okay, let's get going.
Did you want to end the questions? Or?
Well, if there's desire for more questions, far be it from me from any.
It's up to you. It's up to you. I'll leave it up to.
All right, so we'll take these last two questions, and then we've got all kinds of food, and we can all mingle informally.
Okay. Great. Thank you. My name is William Casari, professor in the library. Thank you very much for your engaging presentation style. Really appreciate it. My question is kind of a downer, I'm afraid, and it's not really about Hostos, but could you talk, I don't know if everyone in the audience is, maybe they are aware of the current situation between Haiti and the Dominican Republic with regard to the citizenship question. Could you maybe, I guess my question is, I can't believe that happened. What can we do about it? Maybe you could just let the audience know, or if you could let us know how you're thinking about it and what, I haven't articulated it myself. I just kind of pretended it didn't happen. I'm like, oh, that's going on. What do I do about that, if anything? And it's come up here a couple times recently. I'm not really sure how to articulate it or think about it. I hope that's not too much.
Well, help me out. So last fall, the story starts many years early. Well, first of all, let's reframe it. It's not between Haiti and the DR. It's about Dominicans born in the Dominican Republic now denied their nationality. Because it's not a Haiti-DR issue. They're not, right? And so they could be. I mean, well, if they're born of Haitian parents and the Haitian parents sign them up in the consulate and everything, they could be Haitian nationals, but they're not. And what they're trying to do is reclaim and reassert their Dominican nationality, having been born in the DR, of Haitian parents or a mixture of the two. So that's an important reframing, because then I'm afraid that sometimes it gets framed as like a dreamer question, which it is not in the U.S. The dreamer issue of undocumented children, brought to the United States, by parents, by family, and then now getting access, through the DREAM Act to services or some kind of in-between citizenship. That's not what we're talking about either. So last fall, the Tribunal Constitucional decided on a case, and numerous cases have been coming through both Dominican courts and the Inter-American court system, trying to decide the question of citizenship for individuals, right, coming through the system. And then what the tribunal basically did in deciding the case of one individual was to expand from that one individual case and denationalize, I guess that's the awkward term for it, an entire group of people. It said, even though you're born in DR, in the Dominican Republic, you do not have citizenship on the basis that you were born to people who either illegally resided in the country or were in transit, right, and did not fill out the proper. But some of the legal cases also had to do with people just trying to access their paperwork in the first place, like getting access to birth certificates, other documents that probably would have allowed them to then get access to other more important legal documents that one needs to do much of anything else in the DR. So, as I said, and I guess we can have a longer conversation about this, because I see some really great and wonderful things happening, I think, at the activist level on the ground, both in Santo Domingo, in the United States, in New York in particular. So I am really hopeful about what I see. I also am kind of concerned, because something that I think we've talked about before is that the discursive space for embracing any kind of alternative, identity to Dominicanidad in the most narrow way possibly imagined is very, very slim to narrow to none, right? That is to say, what I worry about sometimes is in, reclaiming Dominicanness, that we're not really changing what Dominicanness is. In other words, are we changing this Dominicanness to affirm Black identities, right? That may include Haitian, that may include other notions of African descendancy. But what I will say is, and why I think this event around Hostos is so important, is because what Hostos and Luperon and Betances and Martí and Femen Antenor, a Haitian intellectual, writing at the same moment, and in fact, he will get a letter in 1905 from Federico Enriquez Carvajal asking him, would you like to contribute to this book that we're writing about the Antillean thinkers? And